Everyone, thank you for thanks for being here. Thank you for your patience as well. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm so grateful, and the hospitality already, which we're going to talk about today, has been incredibly nice. I hope you all got some lunch, and please don't shy, keep eating, enjoy the wonderful lunch. I will do my best to keep to time, so we've got plenty of time to have a bit of discussion as well. But before I go any further, I would just really like to extend my thanks to the Migration, Mobilities and Social Politics Research Cluster here, to everyone involved, but particularly to Sarah, who I emailed out of the blue before coming to Canada, and she'd probably regret ever responding because I haven't left her alone since. So thank you, Sarah, so much for all the help in getting here today, and a very generous offer to come and speak. I'm here for, well, I'm visiting Toronto, visiting Canada for a few months on what is effectively a kind of research sabbatical from Macquarie University in Sydney. Jessica Hamby, who you should all say hello to as well, is visiting as well. And we're currently at the York Centre for Refugee Studies. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to be here, a bit of a break from teaching. Supposedly I'm going to come up with some incredible research, but really the opportunity to come and meet people and speak is what is so nice. And it's not an egotistical thing about coming and making you all listen. It's about not sitting in an office somewhere where I can do that anywhere. To meet you all. So thank you so much. The idea of coming here is based on some research that I've been doing for maybe 5 years, and again, apologies to, well, particularly Jess, who's had to hear this in various iterations for way too long. But in part, relates to the here and now in the Canadian context as well. And so I really am looking forward to learning and hearing from you. Perhaps I'm not here to tell you about your backyard and your area. Focused particularly on Australia and the UK, but I think there are very strong areas of relevance here to Canada and elsewhere. And I'll come to explain why, in part, being here in Toronto is not just being here in Ontario is not just about writing up some work. It's actually about what's happening here as well. So just a little bit of history or background, I guess, but this work began in the kind of late stages of 2019 in Australia. Of course, we all know what happened soon after that in 2020, and actually I was in Toronto about a week before the world kind of started to shut down in Australia especially. But at that moment in time, a very kind of odd convergence of things happened where Australia's use of offshore detention, which you may or may not be aware of. I think, unfortunately, we have a bit of a global reputation as being the most punitive approach to asylum and refugees, particularly through the use of indefinite detention, both onshore and offshore. And offshore, not only on Australian territory, however we wish to frame that, but also particularly on former territories that Australia has ruled in different ways. It still has its tentacles in independent nations of Nauru and Papua New Guinea. And at that moment in 2019, through some magic and probably a lot of hard work, the provision was passed that allowed some people to come to the mainland to receive medical care that they were not getting in offshore detention in most of the foreign situations. And I'm sure many of you know about this. You may have read some of the really important work that's come from those who were detained there. So, for this moment in time before it was repealed, people would come to Australia and get medical care. This didn't really happen. And during this time, for reasons I maybe will never know, Australia decided, Australian government, to detain those who had come for medical care in hotels rather than many established detention facilities. And this is all very quiet. Of course, then COVID happens and all kinds of other things where perhaps the Australian government never thought would be the case. But people started becoming very aware that in a few hotels, very prominently in major cities, Melbourne and Brisbane in particular, people were being detained in these hotels, and this is prior to COVID, so these hotels were running in various functions, but they are hyper visible in a strange way as well. So some work I was doing and advocacy as well around detention, started to look at the hotels. Things became a bit different with COVID because then concerns changed to the fact that people were then locked into these hotels as well. Australia was using, during particularly 2020 and 2021, hotel quarantine for returned Australian citizens and even going between states, the equivalent of crossing provinces here. And people were going crazy, to the lack of much better term, for 2 weeks of quarantine. In the end, these men were mostly men, almost entirely, not entirely, but almost, were in hotel detention for 2 years. And because of COVID, the very small affordances that were, or privileges that were afforded in hotels to go actually to get outdoor time, you would be transferred to a detention facility, was closed as well. So they literally spent 2 years in a building, probably similar to this, in some ways a couple of public spaces, but mostly in shared rooms, 24/7. And this was after having been detained offshore for 7 years, and on it goes. So, so this was the kind of some background, I guess, the context that started me thinking about, well, what is the role of hotels? And as I'll come to talk about, Australia's actually been using them quietly for 20 plus years, 2002, and they officially brought hotels into the wider detention landscape. Now, the work that I'm going to present today is not at all to say we're the only ones to have ever thought about the role of hotels. There has been some very important work being done, and that we absolutely give credit to them and build upon. Sarah Fregonesi and Adam Ramadan had written a wonderful piece in 2015 called The Geopolitics of Hotels, looking at all the different ways that hotels can be reconfigured and reused in wartime, for accommodation, for humanitarian purposes, of course, for all the other ways we normally think of hotels. Claudio Minca, my former boss, had looked to a particular hotel in Amsterdam and the biopolitics of the ways in which this particular building had been reconfigured over the years in very different ways. And closer to home here, Anna Pratt wrote about celebrity and examined celebrity in the early 2000s. I'll come to talk about that as well. So as I flew into Pearson International Airport with the immense privilege that I carry of an Australian passport that allows me to move around the world and to exit through immigration with the barest of inconveniences. It's very striking that if you know where you're looking, how to look, that right next to Pearson is Canada's largest detention facility. And prior to that particular facility, which was a hotel, was the Celebrity Inn, which is now called something else. I forget, it's probably changing almost weekly. But hotels that have been converted into permanent detention as well. So something that Canada, as a separate colonial nation as well, about its ability to detain and to determine who comes and who goes. So a bit of context there. And before I jump into the talk, just to finally say, this work is very much in collaboration with Professor Jonathan Darling at Durham University. Couldn't join us today. Jonathan and I have been working together for a few years. We rarely see each other in person in physical sense, but this is based on a piece that was just published just a couple of weeks ago, earlier in March, which is always fortuitous when it's at the right time. So I'd be happy to share the details of that, but we'll speak to that today. So full credit to my colleague Jonathan, and who really led this particular piece. The idea of this visit for a few months is that hopefully maybe this might turn into something to finally put this all together after a few years to think about the global hotel, global detention hotel, all the ways in which we might see hotels comparatively, both distinctly, uniquely in certain contexts, but also the ways in which we can see certain trends across the globe. But particularly in nations like Canada, Australia, UK, various EU nations that are mostly the global north receiving nations for people seeking asylum, but also other forms of migration, mobility that we'll talk about as well. And the ways that they've deployed hotels to do very similar, but also very distinct things as well. So while there's all this other work that we give full credit to and we're drawing upon, we note that much of the work on hotels is tended to treat them as individual, looking at a very particular hotel or a particular nation or a particular process, rather than thinking a bit more broadly about the various circulations and ways of control that these hotels work. So today's talk is going to focus on particularly Australia and the UK, but as I mentioned, I think you'll see residents here. I'm very keen. This is where I get a bit selfish. I take from you. I'm keen to hear and learn while I'm here in Ontario and in Canada. Okay, so all of that, jump into it. So in February of 2023, the Merseyside borough of Knowsley made national headlines in the UK following a night of violent disorder outside the Suites Hotel. What began as a peaceful protest, and I use this term loosely, and counter-protest on the use of the hotel to accommodate asylum seekers, descended into violence and confrontations with the police. In the months after, asylum seekers and hotel staff continued to suffer attacks and verbal abuse. Events in Knowsley marked one of the highest profile and most violent in a series of demonstrations against the accommodation of asylum seekers in hotels across the UK. While the dispersal of asylum seekers to areas of relative deprivation is not new, the extensive use of hotels for such a purpose, with little oversight from local authorities and little communication with local communities, has fostered tensions that have coincided with a resurgence in far-right organising. Now, this was in 2023. This is just one particular image of this one night, which was absolutely horrific, but not in isolation. This was followed by further attacks across the UK, and for any of you that may have recall or follow in the UK, last year then saw a whole new wave of right-wing attacks, and particularly focusing on hotels, literal problems, exceptional violence, and seeking to burn hotels to the ground. At a similar time, we can travel to the other end of the globe, to Australia, here to Brisbane, one of our major cities on the east coast. And in contrast to the anti-refugee assaults that were being witnessed at UK hotels, protests outside hotels that are classified as alternative places of detention, or APODs, this is the official Australian government terminology, So places of detention that aren't physically purpose-built detention, which include hotels, but can also include hospitals, psychiatric wards, care homes, anywhere else you might be transferred whilst you're in detention. But hotels in particular, the protests that were occurring during 2020 to 2022 for those men that I mentioned that had been transferred for medical care, it's called the Medivac provision. These protests looked very different. In cities such as Melbourne and Brisbane, protests were instead supportive of asylum seekers, calling for the release of detainees from the torturous conditions of indefinite detention and recognising that this was just one part of a much longer process of detention that these particularly men in this context have been subjected to offshore. That the protests were peaceful events focused on solidarity with detainees could perhaps be connected to the fact that the hotels operated as secure spaces of punitive detention rather than, quote, accommodation, and we'll talk about problematic notion or complex notion of what is accommodation. But in contrast to this use of accommodation of asylum seekers in the UK, so these are closed detention, you are locked into these spaces, there are security guards and so forth. So perhaps this dissuaded anti-refugee mobilisation from occurring because the people were already being punished. This was seen as a punitive response rather than the framing and then much of the media in the UK of the comfort of being in a hotel. But also it pointed to the diverse methods in which hotels are used for matters of asylum. So we're seeing quite contrasting outcomes of same kinds of spaces in Australia and the UK at the same time, but with some very different outcomes. It should be noted also that while protests were happening from the outside, whether in support of those detained, calling for the abolition of detention, the release of these mostly men, but also women and children, that really the groundswell of organising a protest that led to the most significant change was that being organised by those being detained within. If you kind of squint, you can see the banners on the front here, and just to the right, groups of men on the balconies. So a strange kind of space because mostly we think of detention, and Australia loves using very remote places, including Christmas Island, territory thousands of miles offshore, or in our deserts and so forth, or behind giant razor walls. So Sydney has the largest detention facility in the centre of the city, somewhat in the centre of the suburbs. Perhaps most people don't know it's there, but it's very proximate. But this was quite different. Protesters in this context could actually converse without even the use of amplification. You could just talk back and forth. Some members of the community were partners of those detained inside, so it was a strange context. And as you can see in the kind of setting here, this is, I mean, if you've been to Brisbane, it's just outside of the downtown skyscrapers, but it's effectively the inner suburbia. It's the most mundane of urban environments. And so you can walk past these places. It's part of what we're looking into without ever knowing what's happening inside. Except in this case where you have people protesting and trying to close the streets. This was quite unique. Other hotels looked more like this image here on the screen. This is Melbourne Park Hotel. This is on the street where I used to go to university. It's just a few blocks away, driving downtown. The difference here is there are no balconies, the windows are sealed, and the government perhaps started to pivot a little in being slightly more punitive in the use of hotels, recognising that this ability to communicate was creating headaches for them. This hotel, as mentioned, was also used during COVID, initially as a quarantine hotel. And as Melbourne will, or anyone from Melbourne, will proudly tell you, perhaps proudly, it's the wrong word, but they were the most locked down city in the world during COVID. Whether or not that's actually the case, we can discuss. Quarantine was a highly controversial approach to dealing with the pandemic. And here I'm not here to tell you what works and doesn't work with controlling contagious disease. But this particular hotel was seen as having led to one of the worst outbreaks of COVID across Melbourne that led to a lockdown of the entire city because of mismanagement and so forth, but also that, as we know, caging people often doesn't end well, and it's not effective for many issues. But very quickly after the evacuation of this hotel, realizing its failures to work as a quarantine space, it was converted to hotel detention for these men who had been held in another hotel where the owners of the hotel had decided they were fed up with the protests happening and so forth. It was bad for business. They were one day just bust without warning to this hotel. Okay, so a bit of context there to start us off, and I'm happy to come back to if there's anything that makes sense or you'd like to know more about in this particular context. So the paper that we've worked on and the research that is kind of somewhat the culmination of several years of Jonathan Darling putting up with me, dropping the ball and trying to find Zoom times that work between Australia and the UK. But this work has sought to examine the politics that underpin these examples of contestation of hotel detention and accommodation by considering the central role of hotels in both accommodating and containing asylum seekers and refugees. And I should know it's not only limited to those claiming asylum, but hotels are used also for deportations, for other migrant and visa categories as well. So in both the UK and Australia, hotels have acted as lightning rods for critical discussion and for public concern over state responsibilities, welfare entitlements, and the narrowing scope of refugee protection. And here I'm sure I could change Australia and the UK and drop Canada into this. And I think you'd probably say these are some of the same anxieties that have been occurring. Crucially then, moving beyond these specific cases, we argue that while examinations of hotels as sites of contingency accommodation have drawn attention to the hotel as a flexible space of emergency response, again, we use emergency and recognizing problematic nature of that term, but as a flexible response to various housing crises, focusing on this emergency role overlooks the enduring role of hotels in migration management and the warehousing of asylum seekers. So we see these as very durable spaces that have actually been used in different ways across the globe, many decades. By considering hotel use in the UK and Australia, we argue that the hotel is a durable and vitally important site of bordering infrastructure, one that manifests many of the tensions and contradictions of state responses to asylum seekers and refugees. Far from being a marginal or temporary space, we centre the hotel as a critical site for the reproduction and maintenance of contemporary asylum systems, the filtering and containment of mobile subjects. And so in talking about Pearson, for example, we might think about the ways in which the border, of course, is not always at the extent of the territorial limit of a nation state, the differing ways in which we see bordering infrastructures throughout our, in this case, urban environments. So, path here. So on the one hand, the role of the hotel is, we assert, political and logistical, involving the production of profit and the carceral containment of mobile bodies. On the other hand, the role of the hotel is both cultural and symbolic, involving a set of critical tensions between the responsibilities of the state and its expression of hospitality. And the cultural discourses of luxury and leisure that surround the hotel as a space of commercial hospitality, the way that we most often think of a hotel. The cultural and political significance of the hotel, then, as a critical site for understanding contemporary bordering, is, we argue, drawn from this unique confluence of the carceral and the hospitable. In addressing this confluence, we propose a concept of carceral hospitality, a term intended to designate the fraught positioning of the hotel somewhere between the carceral conditions of institutional detention and spectacle. And I draw here on the work of Cheddar Van Waring and Stefan Silverman, and the hospitable expectations more readily associated with sites of leisure, escapism, and relaxation that we hope we would encounter when we visit a hotel. Carceral hospitality then foregrounds the durable nature of the hotel as a fundamental, if often overlooked, part of how modes of everyday bordering extend into civic spaces and civic practices, and how hotels are situated within carceral economies and networks of value reduction. You particularly draw on the work of Otto Martin, as well as Deirdre Conlon, Nancy Holmstrom, and so forth. So in developing this argument, we focus on three intersecting dynamics that are elaborated upon in the paper and that I'll speak to today, to help us explore how hotels have been situated. Firstly, as forms of flexibility and emergency response. Secondly, through patterns of hospitality. And thirdly, through the violent displacements of the hotel as a site that's detached from what we might call everyday life. In each case, we trace these characteristics through the empirical realities of hotel use in Australia and the UK. And we focus on these countries because both have relatively established histories of employing hotels as infrastructures of state bordering, as I mentioned earlier. In alternative places of detention or APODs, in Australia, hotel use has a markedly carceral lineage. While in the UK, they have been employed as sites of contingency accommodation that blur distinctions of carceral control and hospitable welcoming. So working across these cases will hopefully allow us to consider how distinctions between detention and accommodation are destabilized in practice. In surveying these understandings of the hotel, we work towards an account of carceral hospitality that reflects the entangled forms of support, violence, and contestation that hotels manifest in contemporary bordering. So as mentioned, we're talking to the UK and Australia, but certainly we could be talking to Canada, to the United States, to various other nations across the EU and elsewhere. These are also not contained entirely to the global north, or however we wish to frame this, but we're thinking particularly through these particular contexts in these nations. Here, maybe if you lived in California or in Los Angeles like I did, you often see the work of Lado Alcades. And his image here of the Motel 6, which was seen, his chambers turned out was allowing ICE to the immigration enforcement to come and raid the hotel, giving over information. So differing ways the hotels were being used. Certainly in the US, rooms are used regularly as kind of deportation stop off on the way to the border. There's many other examples. I'm sure you've seen the various outcomes in New York of attempts to accommodate as well in large hotels. So, firstly, our work seeks to advance our understanding of hotel use beyond accounts of emergency response. We position hotels at the heart of systems of sorting and classifying migrants, operating as they do at the interstices of more traditional detention centres and urban spaces of circulation and relative freedom. Elsewhere, we've discussed the hotel as being part of a carceral urbanism, their situatedness within very mundane suburban and urban environments. Exploring the varied roles that hotels have taken up in the UK and Australia, but also recognising their varied roles elsewhere, we argue that, like the short-term holding facilities that are studied by Mary Bosworth, and to quote Mary here, these sites of confinement resist simple explanation as their cultural resonance extends far beyond an infrastructural role as simply, quote, holding cells for the unwanted. These discussions place the hotel at the heart of political and social geographies of conflict, accommodation, and marginality, such that hotels are situated as infrastructures that are quite distinct from sites of luxury, relaxation, and consumption, but they are more commonly framed as. Crucially, these two functions are not mutually exclusive, nor are they necessarily contradictory. Indeed, in many instances of hotel use for migrants, we witness these fraught juxtapositions in which hotels are appropriated for the accommodation of asylum seekers and refugees, at the same time as individual rooms, or entire floors, or entire wings are used to accommodate other groups. And elsewhere, we've looked to carceral adaptability of the hotel. Transform a single room by simply locking a door. You can transform an entire wing. You can transform an entire hotel, depending on need. And sometimes it will fluctuate between homes as well. So this reflects the flexible nature of the hotel as a space able to be rapidly repurposed, reconfigured, and removed from use at short notice. Hotels thus represent transient spaces for temporary dwelling, not permanent habitation, and they can therefore easily be emptied and reconfigured in times of conflict and crisis, to quote Sarah Ferganesi in that moment. So recent scholarship has considered the hotel then as a space of crisis response, as hotels are increasingly mobilised to address housing crises. For Mel Nowicki and colleagues, they note that hotels are, quote, taking on the role of emergency accommodation providers in Western cities, both as a consequence of rising rates of homelessness and relatedly in lieu of adequate and affordable housing stock. This, they suggest, necessitates critical explorations of the sociopolitics of the hotel as a site of everyday crisis response that moves beyond discussions of the hotel as simply a site of geopolitics alone. In the context of asylum and migration, this account of an increased role for hotels in bordering is perhaps only partially accurate, as a preoccupation with the current terms of the hotel risks overlooking these much longer histories, which show a degree of continuity in how states in the global north have appropriated hotels to control migrants. For example, under direct provision, asylum seekers in Ireland have been housed in accommodation centres that are sited in disused hotels, guest houses, holiday camps, hostels, and caravan parks since at least the late 90s. And the work of Alana Lenton particularly has looked at this. But this is not to suggest that emergency responses have not become more widespread in recent years, but instead to recognise the important forms of continuity and change that mark hotel use. And so we're talking about provision of housing and shelter, and certainly, I'm sure you're aware, but in Toronto, Plaza Hotel, I think it was called, has shifted between crisis, emergency, whatever we want to frame it, housing for those who are unhoused, but also for displaced Syrian refugees, and has shifted in its purpose as well, and the contestations that come over that and its use by surrounding residents across Canada. Does anyone recognise this image here? Skyline Hotel. Narrow a country. Good. That's exactly the answer. These spaces are mundane. they're completely able to be ignored and walk past. Just an idea of tourism, we're busy, the tourists, we went to Niagara Falls on the weekend. And like always, I like to ruin a nice day out by thinking about spaces of detention and research, and we traipse off to various corners and random people on the street ask us, are you lost? And we say, no, we're exactly where we're looking to be. As we try to find the Skyline Hotel situated about 2 streets back from Niagara Falls. If you've been there, there's the water park, and all the other mini Vegas sights and sounds of Niagara. And this is a standard cheap accommodation if you're a tourist visiting. And indeed, as we walked past and looked like, well, probably just tourists coming back to the hotel, other guests were walking out on their way to the water park, down to the falls, and so forth. But the Skyline is just one of hundreds of examples, I suspect, across Canada, and one of tens, at least, of examples in Niagara, particularly, that has been converted over time back and forth and shifts in its role between accommodation, detention, and tourism. Sometimes perhaps all at once. As far as I can trace, this particular hotel has been employed or used by Canadian government since 1992. I could be wrong, and I welcome any insights. But I'm not really trying to single out this hotel, it's just indicative of the wider. I believe it was used at times specifically for detention. Now, I'm not sure of its status, doesn't really matter in some sense, but it's tended to be accommodation in relation to the Roxham Road kind of context and crossing. Again, I don't need to tell you, you can tell me much more about this time and the political sort of framing of this moment here in this nation state. But there is a lot of anxiety across Niagara about the amount of hotels that were being used, pressures around tourism, all the other challenges that Niagara faces, as I understand it. Again, I've literally spent an afternoon there, I know nothing of the context truly, but as I understand, severe housing shortage, homelessness, at significant levels, and all kinds of other challenges that these small towns, even though Niagara is quite a unique situated town, that are then grappling with these contexts as well. So just one of many examples. Okay. So secondly, we seek to advance an understanding of the hotel as a specific type of social and political space. In much work to date, the specificity of the hotel has been largely overlooked. While hotels have been examined as modes of temporary accommodation, their cultural association with forms of hospitality and expectations of escapism and anonymity have received little consideration. This serves to position hotels as little more than adaptable accommodation centres as opposed to the much more complex sites of cultural meaning and association that they represent, encompassing both commercial framings of hospitality associated with leisure, luxury and escapism, and more political understandings of hospitality as a practice of welcoming strangers. We argue that these cultural reference points matter and that they shape not only how hotels are perceived as sites of carceral hospitality, but also how this role is challenged and contested, both from those seeking to advance migrants' rights and those set on restricting such rights. In looking to the specificity of the hotel as a space of often incomplete hospitality, we argue that the hotel is more than simply another site of containment within logistical chains of reception and detention. It is the cultural associations of the hotel as a hotel that inform the politicization of hotel use and that distinguish hotels from other forms of border infrastructure. In both the Australian and British contexts, attachments to imaginaries of hospitality still run through the politics of migration, even in context of overtly hostile policies. It is unsurprising that as a result, media coverage in both contexts has positioned the use of hotels as a costly extravagance that enables those seeking asylum to live in quote luxury at the expense of taxpayers, a factor argued to act as an incentive to seek asylum. And somehow everyone is desiring to be locked up in the most mundane of suburban hotels. And a factor that is only heightened in its salience by the cost of living crisis that I suspect is very much being felt here as I hear about coming elections and so forth. Australia is absolutely living, cost of living is front and centre in housing shortages. So the hotel then is central to these imaginaries and to reproducing accounts of national hospitality as a resource that is both revered and threatened by the realities of migration. And here we draw particularly on the work Jacques Derrida and Cello. Please don't ask me to talk about Derrida, this is not my little area, but I'm sure many of you will know and recognise the connections here. So as a battleground for contestations over the treatment of asylum seekers and the expectations of citizens, understanding the role of hotels is critical to ongoing public and academic debate over how far legal responsibilities to protect those seeking asylum extend and the conditions through which such obligations are made. And here, just a very quick example we can look to, and I don't ever suggest if you haven't already to go and read Daily Mail, one of the UK's most long-standing tabloid bounded racism and nationalism. But we see an image here from a few years ago listing all the hotels that were at that time being used for asylum accommodation across the UK, and in the most transparent way possible, actually a cheat sheet for far-right groups to know exactly where to go. This was, of course, framed also in the context here of, you know, you can't even go and stay in a hotel anymore, and taxpayer dollars, and these are, you know, these grand luxurious places, and these folks are coming, putting their feet up in your hotels. But really, this was a call to go to these hotels as well, very thinly veiled, and absolutely had that effect. Some other work we've been doing has looked at the dangers and the politics of visibility. Of course, we need to know where people are being detained in order to advocate, to ensure legal access, all kinds of other ways that we might think of the importance of knowing these sites. But the flip side is a visibility that puts people in exceptionally precarious positions that leads to pogroms at the very buildings. In the Australian context, we sought to map as many of the alternative places of detention that Australia has employed since 2002. And you can go through to the Carceral Centre for International Refugee Law, where this map is hosted, and it received a little bit of coverage. But we had severe anxiety about what we were trying to do with this. What is the outcome of this mapping? We were trying to understand where these sites are, because there is literally, and I actually believe the government for once, they don't know where all these sites were, have been, could be. We found about 36, but we were told that there are 150 just in current use. But this came through significant political pressure, freedom of information had failed, and so forth. We still really don't know. We were contacted about this map by the government. One of those calls you're not expecting, and then someone who doesn't really tell you who they are says, "What are you doing? We're quite concerned. We'd rather you didn't do this." And we thought, oh, maybe there is a danger to publishing this, even though there hadn't been far-right mobilisations in Australia. But what were the politics of this visibility? And they said, yes, we're concerned about violence. Okay, perhaps we won't do this. We're concerned about left-wing groups going and advocating for the release of asylum seekers. Government were not concerned about right-wing groups going and kicking doors because they're sick of those places. So we did publish this, and we found, and they confirmed, that all the sites we had found were no longer in use. So there was really very little risk but also that these change daily. It might be a single room in the most mundane possible environments, often usually not entire hotels like shown here, often in single rooms. I found my primary school, there's a hotel across the road that they would use a room, just nondescript spaces. So anyways, without going too much into that, the differing ways, and then we might see advocacy and contestation over these sites, but the politics that comes with identifying these locations. So third and finally, we seek to expand beyond the specificity of the hotel to advance an understanding of the interrelations of the carceral and the hospitable by foregrounding how radically divergent experiences of accommodation, escapism, leisure, and incarceration coexist within the violent inequalities of global mobility. We propose a focus that connects the carceral security of geographies of detention and expulsion and the patterns of welcome associated with geographies of hospitality. Bodies of work that have tended to operate in parallel. In the paper, you can see all the works that we draw upon. I won't go into those, but to recognise these as significant bodies of thinking and work, also not unique to geography. But our focus on carceral hospitality addresses the contradictions of the carceral and the hospitable, reflecting on the parasitical relation of hospitality and hostility that Derrida mentions. It characterises contemporary geographies of order. And in doing so, we argue that through the example of the hotel, practices of welcoming, controlling, containing, and accommodating refugees and asylum seekers are interwoven, increasingly selective geographies of limited and often illusory refuge that reflect the restrictive realities of the global refugee project. So the functional adaptability of the hotel that I've mentioned, so essential to its capacity to play this role, as both contingency, accommodation, and detention, is matched with a cultural openness that provides opportunities for hotel space to be interpreted and used in multiple ways by a range of users. Hotels offer spaces outside the ordinary for most people's everyday social life, distinct from our normal place at home, and present sites of anonymity where guests can simply disappear. A few years ago, I was presenting this work at the big geography conference in the US. We're in a Hilton, and I said we could possibly be in a site of detention as we speak. And certainly the Hiltons have been used at different times. But here we were in a global academic conference, the differing ways that they can be reconfigured. So these cultural associations of the hotel as a site of leisure and escape sit in tension with the hotel as a space of emergency accommodation or detention. This tension is manifest not only in the incongruence of placing guests who are tourists alongside those who are seeking asylum, but also in the mixed cultural messaging that such proximate diversity produces. And often the case is that we would find out about hotels, or lawyers would find out about hotels, or the media would find out, because someone who was just on a holiday or a business trip where it's like, there's some security outside my door, what's going on, and amongst many other examples. So these converging demands on hotels produce dynamics of escapism and relaxation for some, and the restriction of everyday life for others. At the same time, the assumption of the hotel as a site of anonymity and freedom sits in tension with the forms of security, identification, and monitoring that emerge when hotels are used as sites of containment by the state. Of course, even if you're being accommodated, not in close attention, you're being tracked very carefully. There are curfews, there are all kinds of ways that your mobility is restricted. So in these contexts, the conditional welcome of commercial hospitality is replaced with a more assertive conditional accommodation that requires the identification of guests as a means to support their monitoring and control. It is the cultural assumptions of luxury and leisure that drive many of the tensions behind hotel use for this form of conditional accommodation. And so we see the troubling echoes of this violent relation in contemporary accounts of carceral use of hotels, and in the colonial politics of hospitality that pervade hotel use. Tracing these connections, we might consider how hotels are not secure or safe sites of escapism for all guests, but rather operate spaces of differential inclusion that mask the violence they sustain within the guise of hospitality. And certainly there is much work on historical hotels, the colonial hotel, such as in South Africa and other contexts in which the hotel takes a very different form of coloniality and distinction of who belongs and who does not. So if the colonial hotel was simultaneously a site of comfort and concealment, the contemporary hotel displays these same trends as a site of managing displaced people, controlling those subject to sovereign authority, while concealing the violence involved. In a context where border controls and mobility are framed as colonial projects of racialized injustice, the role of the hotel shows considerable continuity. The sorting of mobility is enacted by state commandeered hotels represents a filtering embedded in racialized notions of value and categorization that bear the legacies of colonial hierarchies of human value and have reproduced stark distinctions between the comfort of commercial hospitality for some and the confinement of border exclusion for racialized others. The contemporary hotel thus becomes a means through which the violence of carceral control and the warehousing of asylum seekers is obscured. And I won't go further here, running out of time, but context here of this is the Mantra Hotel in Melbourne before it moved to the Park Hotel. And again, see one slightly cracked window, which is as far as they would open, people were trying to communicate, but the complete takeover of a certain wing of this hotel, but oddly in a local government area. That's how I guess the spatial container of how we think about Australian towns or cities, local government regions, but within Melbourne, where this council, this local government, is actually classified as a welcoming city, refugee welcome zone. Local government, I'm sure the same here, has no say in federal or state politics around detention, but this contrast of what is supposedly a welcoming community hosting these foreign sites of detention. So, to wrap up in these last two slides, is to come back to this notion of carceral hospitality. And so building on the framings of the hotel and the varied cultural, political, and social geographies that we've discussed, we argue that hotels are uniquely situated as a space of convergence between logics of carceral control and political assertions of limited and conditional hospitality. This convergence reflects a condition of carceral hospitality, a concept that offers critical insight into two dimensions of the contemporary hotel as a site of ordering. So firstly, the carceral hospitality describes the processes through which hotels become these locations for the control, containment, and bordering requirements. In this way, sites of commercial hospitality and leisure become entwined in networks of carcerality, political relations of exclusion, and economic practices of value extraction. It is this process of appropriation and entwinement that we have identified in the cases from Knowlesley, Melbourne, Brisbane, and beyond. Secondly, carceral hospitality reaches beyond this process of appropriation to reflect how hospitality requires conditions and measures of control that easily become carceral in nature, as the welcome of some is predicated on the restriction and containment of others. While such contradictions of welcome are not new, their expression through the unique cultural and infrastructural characteristics of the hotel reflects the spatial manifestation of carceral hospitality. The contradictions of carceral hospitality then are best expressed through the use of hotels, reflecting a culmination of the tensions that have shaped responses to refugee displacement across the global north, and positioning the hotel as a space that is neither strictly carceral nor purely hospitable. So, last slide. I'll shut up. This concern with carceral hospitality perhaps then serves to highlight hotels as infrastructures of bordering that are distinct from the strictly carceral or the purely hospitable. It is the merging of these conditions that sets carceral hospitality apart and differentiates it. For example, the use of hotels to accommodate and detain migrants stands in contrast to the physical infrastructures of detention, that Mainwaring and Silverman argue are central to the detention as spectacle. That is, the use of barbed wire, CCTV, and disciplinary spaces of military institutions typically associated with detention, but that are typically absent from the hotel. In the UK, this has led to hotel use to be positioned in contrast to the use of military barracks and temporary encampments to accommodate asylum seekers, raising critical questions over whether hotels are supposedly too good for those seeking refuge. In Australia, hotels, which were initially used to remove women and children from mandatory detention in carceral facilities, typically located in the desert, have instead become carceral spaces in their own right. The Australian Human Rights Commission, one of the very few bodies that can enter spaces of prisons and detention, we kicked the UN out the other month to say we're one of the only countries in the world that wouldn't allow the UN to come and inspect these spaces. But the Human Rights Commission has consistently said that these are the most punitive of the detention spaces. There is a far less, and this is not to say that there's a good detention and a bad detention. Scale of depravity, and hotels are absolutely at the worst end. And here is the Best Western Hotel has changed names, as they all do after they have these contracts, to shake off this legacy. But while these protests were happening in Melbourne, and at times there were hundreds, if not thousands of people, although this was during COVID lockdown, so it's very difficult to protest. This hotel was quietly detaining people and no one had any idea, a few kilometres away. And as I mentioned earlier, the lawyer was called by someone in detention saying, hey, we're all here, can someone come and help? And that was the first renewal of it. So as sites of carceral hospitality, hotels remain wedded to cultural codings around hospitality, leisure, and welcome, which means they are unable to fulfill the symbolic and cultural function of a typical detention space. As Mainwaring and Silverman argue, detention spaces, quote, reinforce logics of deviance, threat, and punishment, as their architecture, conditions, and aesthetics communicate the idea that those subjects they contain require detention. By contrast and in conclusion, hotels are spaces that are neither wholly carceral nor wholly hospitable, and this again makes them emblematic sites of the contemporary global refugee regime. So trapped between hospitability and hostility, the hotel reflects the violent disjunctures, displacement, and dispossession in our political present.